you've spent any time around the channel at all, you will know that I am not a fan of facings. I much prefer a full lining, but sometimes there are no better options than a facing for whatever project you are using. And so I have decided to show you a few different ways that you can finish your facings so that they look nice and polished on the inside and won't fray. I just have a random facing here, which is actually from the By Hand London Anatop, but these methods will work for everything. I have interfaced this one and sewn it together, so I have got the raw edges here, and because of the interfacing, theoretically it shouldn't fray too much, so you could leave it completely like this if you wanted to, but it can fray a little bit over time. Also, it's not my favourite look. So the first option I have is pinking shears. This is a really basic but easy method of finishing off any edge on the inside of your garments and having it not fray, or fray much less than it would if left completely raw. And so you would literally go around and trim off the very edge of your facing the whole way around. If you do decide to go down this route, this is what you will end up with. It is a way of making sure that this doesn't fray, and it's not an unattractive edge. I have used this finish on the inside of some of my garments, but majority of the times when they're going to be fully lined as well, and in skirts like the 8577 if you've watched that sew along. So you can leave it completely like this, or you can take things a step further. I'm going to sew a line of stitching 3/8 of an inch away from the pinked edge to give me a guide, which I will use for the next step of the next method for finishing your facing. Okay, hopefully you can see here that I have a line of stitching about 3/8 of an inch away from the pinked edge. I'm going to use that as a pressing guide, so I'm going to go and press that all under at the ironing board, and I'll come back and show you what the next step is. As you can hopefully see, I have used that line of stitching as a pressing guide, and I've pressed under the pinked edge. Now obviously this would not survive being washed, for example, so I'm going to run a line of edge stitching all the way around this edge to secure it into place. That will just give a slightly, in my opinion, neater finish than the pinking will. So I'm going to get the edge stitching done the whole way around. Because it's decorative, theoretically decorative even though it's on the inside of a garment, I am going to increase my stitch length to 3.5 just so it looks a little bit nicer than the construction length stitch that I've used to sew these pieces together. So I'll get that done and show you what it looks like. I've just given it a quick press, but that is the pinked edge folded under and top stitch down, and it's given it quite a nice thin edge. There's not a lot of bulk there, which is something that you do want to be concerned about, especially if you're using a very lightweight fabric like this viscose. I think this is still available. I will link it in the description down below. So that is the second option for finishing off your facings. If you have an overlocker, that's a great way of finishing a raw edge like this. If you don't have an overlocker but your sewing machine will do a zigzag stitch, that is another great way of finishing off your facings. So it's the next one that I'm going to try. Now you can probably tell that I have never tried that before because it's not the neatest of things that you've ever seen. And when I was trying to get my zigzag very, very close to the edges, it ended up just making it fray even more. And I'm not 100% sure those stitches would hold over a long period of time and many washes. So I kind of then moved around to doing the zigzag next to the edge rather than right on the edge, and it does give a neater finish. As you can see, I kind of fell off the edge there as well, but I don't love this. You can do exactly the same thing with this one that I showed you with the last one, which is to run a line of guide stitching, press that under and top stitch it down just to give you a nice neat edge. But honestly, if you're going to go through those steps, I would say just pink it first, because you're adding bulk with this thread in this part here if you then do press it under and top stitch it down. So I would say pink it and turn it under like we did with the last one. But this is a viable option, and it is something that you can do if you don't own pinking shears, if you don't own an overlocker, and you don't want to do any of the following methods that I'm going to show you. All in all, not my favourite, wouldn't ever do this one, I don't think. Some machines do have the ability to do an overlock stitch and it will look like this. Obviously it won't include cutting the fabric before it stitches it like a serger or an overlocker does, but it does do the kind of binding of the edge of your fabric. So if your sewing machine has that option, that's another one to do instead of maybe this zigzag. But if your machine only does a zigzag and you don't like any of the other options that I'm going to show you, then this is a valid way of finishing off your facings. I haven't pressed this one either. Giving it a press would help it out a lot, I'm sure, but yeah, not my favourite. Next up, I want to show you one of my favourite methods, which is bias binding. This is some pre-bought bias binding that I will link in the description down below. You can of course make your own and use the exact same fabric as the garment or project that you're making. With a lightweight fabric like this viscose, that could be preferable to the polyester satin one that I've got here, because this can get bulky quite quickly, and especially if you're using an even lighter weight fabric than this. So that is something to bear in mind. But for the sake of the demonstration, I am going to use this shop bought bias binding. So I want to take the right edge of the bias binding and I'm going to sew it to the wrong edge of the facing. So I've opened up my bias binding. I'm just going to pin this into place and I'll show you. So I've opened up one of the folds of my bias binding and I've lined up the raw edge to the raw edge of the outer part of the facing, because obviously if you were finishing a garment with this, this is the neck hole and you do want to finish your facing before you start attaching it to your garment. This is the centre back or centre front depending on what you're making seam, and then this is the neck edge. So the right side of the binding to the wrong side of your facing, open up the one fold, get the raw edges aligned, and we're going to sew in this stitch the whole way around the facing. I have sewn the binding on all the way around, so I'm now going to go and give it a press. One of the nice things about bias binding is that it's slightly malleable. I'm going to give it a nice press so it's lying nice and flatly out like that, and then I can press it so that the folded edge will go over and meet up with that previous line of stitching. If you just cover that previous line of stitching, even better. So I'm going to go and give this a press and then we can finish off sewing the bias binding to the facing. I have pressed everything flat and then pressed the edge of my bias binding over. So I'm now going to go around and edge stitch that into place, and I'm going to do that with, again, a slightly longer stitch length so it just looks a little bit more attractive. So I'm going to get that done and then I'll show you what it looks like. Just given everything a quick press so it all lies nice and flatly, and you can see what were kind of curly edges now are lying nicely and flatly at the curvy corners. I really like this finish. I've used this finish a lot. I like adding a pop of colour with a contrasting binding like this. You can buy some really pretty bindings as well to make the inside look more interesting, as long as the colour doesn't show through to your outer garment. This can get a little bulky though. This is not like badly bulky because we are using a viscose fabric, but that is something to bear in mind, the amount of layers that you are building up, especially if it's a very lightweight garment. This tends to be my preferred finish for something like a coat facing or a jacket facing. I do sometimes use this inside of dresses, but I have a finish that I much prefer, which I'm going to show you in a second. But I have one more technique to show you with some bias binding, and that's called a Hong Kong finish, which, believe it or not, this isn't. I got it wrong in a previous video. This is a bias band finish and I'm going to show you a Hong Kong finish next. The Hong Kong finish is a little bit different to a bias bound finish, so there is a slightly different order of operations. This time round we are going to take our bias binding and we're going to put the right side of the binding to the right side of the facing, and you want to do the same thing as before. Open up that folded edge of the bias binding, line up the raw edges, and we are going to stitch in that folded ditch, but this time it's right side of binding to right side of facing. So I'm going to get this stitched all the way around and then I'll show you the next step. As you can see, I've sewn the binding to the right side of the fabric piece. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go and press everything nice and flat from this edge, and we're actually going to press out this crease so that it ends up with the raw edge on display. This method is probably going to be easier with a bias binding that you've made rather than a store-bought one, because this crease has obviously been well and truly set in there. It's going to be possible, it's going to be fine for a demonstration, but if you are going to try this particular finish, you might want to use bias binding that you've made yourself for this method. So I'm going to go and press everything nice and flat, and so that that raw edge is visible, and then I'm going to press everything around to cover the raw edge. So we're going to end up with the raw edge on display on the wrong side of the binding. So I'm going to go get that pressed and I'll show you what it looks like. So I've pressed everything out, and then I have pressed the back flat and wrapped the raw edge around. So I'm now going to go and top stitch around this edge the same way we did previously, with a 3.5 slightly longer stitch length than I use for construction. I'm going to aim to catch all of the excess binding that we've got on the back side here. So I'm going to stitch the whole way around, back stitching at the beginning and the end, securing everything in place. I've just given it a quick press, and that's what this ends up looking like, which is very, very similar to the bias bound edge, but when you flip this over, then you've obviously still got the raw edge. The reason you might want to do this is because it is less bulky than the bias bound edge, minusculely, but there is one less layer of fabric in this one than there is in this one, and this is called a Hong Kong finish. Honestly, given the types of applications that I would use this finish on a facing, I would probably go for the bias binding, just because it's a finish that I'm more familiar with and use more often. There are reasons for this kind of an application, especially if you've got thicker fabrics and you want to just remove one less layer of bulk, and it is thinner to the touch as well if it's not completely obvious on screen, but the difference is one layer of fabric. But it is a finish that is used for facings, and it is one that I thought I would show you. We're moving on to technically the last way of finishing the facing that I have to show you today, but there are two methods for doing it, and this is the first method, and it's the one I don't like quite so much. I have also messed up when I was cutting out my facing pieces, and I managed to cut out the front piece with a giant hole missing from it. So we're just going to work with the two back pieces, and I will sew them together at the center back, and you will just have to pretend that it's a full facing piece. So I've got my two back facing pieces here, and then I don't know if you can see, but I've got my corresponding interfacing pieces here that I haven't fused to the fabric as yet, because we need to do something slightly different. I'm going to put these right sides together, and the right side of your interfacing is the non-sticky side, so the non-glue side. So we're going to put those together, and we're actually going to sew at 1/4 inch all the way around what would be the finished edge of our facing piece, and we're doing that as separate pieces, so there hasn't been anything sewn together as yet, which is an important distinction to note. So we've got our right sides together, and we are going to sew the interfacing to the facing piece around the edge that you want to have finished, so the non-neck edge of your facing piece, and you're going to do that at 1/4 inch. We're going to do that for both pieces, or all three pieces if you didn't fluff up like me and cut out a facing piece with a giant hole in it. I was trying to do this out of my scraps. So I'm going to get these pinned and sewn into place, and I'll show you what that looks like. I have sewn around the outer edge at 1/4 inch. Now usually I do have another step to make this edge slightly easier to finish, and I'm going to show you that for the next method, but for this one I'm not, because I have seen other people just flip this over. So we are going to go over to the ironing board, and obviously you can't press this seam open because the glue would stick to things that you don't want it to, so you're going to finger press this edge all the way around, and you want to prioritize rolling the interfacing to the inside so that you can see a little bit of the outer fabric. So you're going to do that the whole way around, and then you are going to very carefully press your interfacing and stick your interfacing to your facing piece, and you obviously want to do that for both pieces. So I'm going to go get that done, and I'll bring it back and show you what it looks like. That's everything pressed into place, and it does give you a beautiful, nice finished edge with very, very little bulk added in there. But I don't like doing this method this way because because I now have two separate pieces that I have to sew together, which as I say, I'm going to do along what technically is the center back seam. And I think you guys already can see the error, it's not error, the flaw in this method. And again, I am going to show you my preferred method and the one that I use most often next. But just pretend I'm sewing the shoulder seams together like I have with all of the other facings that I've shown you. So I'm going to get this sewn into place and pressed open. So I've sewn this together and it looks great, but you have raw seam allowance left hanging free on the inside of the facing. Now again, this is going to be on the inside of a garment. It's not a high stress area, and you have got interfacing stuck to your raw edges, so it's not like it's going to fray. You could always pink those edges as well, but there is a different method for this finish, and it's the one that I use and like the most, and is my go-to method anytime that I have to put a facing in if I'm not using bias binding. So I have my fabric pieces here and I have the corresponding pieces of interfacing. I'm going to sew these together with the seam allowance at the shoulder seams, and we're going to be sewing the interfacing facing pieces together, right sides together. So the right side of the interfacing is the non-glue side. So if you have a feel of this, this is the smooth side and then this is the rough side. So that rough side is the wrong side, and you want to make sure that you are sewing together this in the correct manner, which that one is. And so we're going to do exactly the same with our interfacing as we've done with our facing pieces. So we're going to pin that and we're going to sew that together along these shoulder seams, or what would be the shoulder seams, and we're going to sew that the same seam allowance as the pattern calls for. I'm using 5/8 of an inch because it's the one that I use the most often, but whatever seam allowance your pattern calls for, you sew your interfacing together at that seam allowance as well as your facing. So I'm going to get that pinned into place and get both of those sewn. Both of these are now sewn together at what is effectively the shoulder seam. Now obviously the interfacing facing piece you cannot press, not yet anyway, but you want to kind of try and finger press this seam open and keep it as open as possible when we sew it to the facing. I can however go and press my facing shoulder seams open, so I'm going to get that done. I'll be right back to show you the next step. My seams are pressed open, so I'm going to lie this down right side up, and we're going to take our interfacing facing piece, that's a tongue twister, try saying that 5 times fast or don't, and right sides together we are going to lay those on top of each other. As I mentioned, you want to make sure that your seam allowance of your interfacing piece is pinned and sewn open. Definitely want to make sure that that is as open as possible, but we are going to pin all the way around this outer edge and we are going to sew at 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to get that done and I will show you what it looks like. I have sewn the interfacing to the facing right sides together, so this is the glue side and that's the two right sides. Now before I turn this around and press it, I'm actually going to trim off the excess of the seam allowance with my pinking shears. This is something I didn't do on the last one, just to sort of show that it was possible to do it without doing this step if you don't own pinking shears. But by pinking this edge, especially around the curves, you're essentially clipping into the curves and allowing them to turn and lie more flatly when we put the wrong sides together and fuse the interfacing to the facing piece with the iron. It'll also help reduce any bulk in the edge of the facing piece because we're trimming away a bunch of fabric that otherwise would have just been caught and fused into this seam. So I'm going around and I'm trimming away just under 1/4 of an inch away from my stitching line, and I'm going to do that the whole way around. So I've trimmed off all the excess. And we're going to do the same thing that we did last time. We want to turn it so that the wrong sides are together and we are going to finger press the edge. And you want to prioritize having a small piece of the fabric showing on this wrong side over having the interfacing showing on the fabric side of your facing. So I'm going to go around and finger press all this into place, and then I'm going to go and fuse the the interfacing to the facing piece to finish off this technique. You want to make sure, as I've mentioned, that the seams or any seams that you have in your facing and interfacing are open when you press it. This will leave you with kind of a little pocket in there that technically you'll be able to get your finger into, because obviously we have the right side of the facing attaching or not attaching because it doesn't have the glue on it, but this edge will then get sewn into the garments, so that little pocket that you create will get closed up when you sew your facing into your final garment. So yeah, I'm going to get this finger pressed all the way around, then I'm going to go and press it and I will show you what it looks like. And here we have our finished facing. Now the reason I like this method as opposed to the last one is my seam allowances are all encased inside of this facing rather than having the two edges flapping free. That is just my preference. I think it's much neater and tidier. If you like this method as well, I have got a full and separate tutorial linked up here and then also in the description down below, so that you don't have to scrub through the entirety of this video to get to this technique. If I have to use a facing for a garment, this is definitely the method that I would choose, especially for lighter weight garments. My second favourite finish is bias binding, and I would use this for coats and heavier weight garments, and I do prefer the bias binding finish over the Hong Kong finish. Again, just personal preference and also the number of times that I've used it and it's worked well for me. So yes, if I have to use a facing, it would be one of these two methods, although given the choice I would line everything. And I will link the playlist of all the different lining tutorials and techniques I have on the channel. I hope you found this useful.